You're listening to Rhythms of Grace, a podcast of Grace Fellowship Church in McClenny, Florida, with pastors Nathaniel Simmons and Joel Griffiths. You can find out more about Grace Fellowship Church at www.gfcbaker.org. What's up, man?
Hey, man. You're floating over
Here we
there?
are. Yeah. We're having
One
to
day-
take
one
a
day-
boat to the store.
People are going to come back and listen to this and be like, what are they talking about? It wasn't a hurricane. I guess it was a tropical storm. I don't really know.
I thought they bumped it up to a Category 1 at some point,
did they?
but I don't know.
Did they? Basically, it was super slow moving. I don't know how much we got. It's still raining at our house, actually sprinkling. Is it raining at your house?
Yeah, maybe a little sprinkle.
Not like it was yesterday, but it is. I heard we got close to 8 inches, maybe. I don't know. My rain gauge only holds 5 inches, so we got more than that.
I've always wondered how the inches are measured. Is there like a standard gauge because if the gauge is wider, then 8 inches is going to mean more than if it's like this, right?
No,
if
so
it's smaller.
It's like, basically, it is just a tube it's a tube like this.
Are all the tubes the same size?
It doesn't matter. So, like, if it's 8 inches,
oh, okay.
it's not just 8 inches in this tube. And no matter how big it is, it moves the water level up 8 inches. Your swimming pool, you could do the same thing in your swimming pool. You mark where your swimming pool is before it started raining. Mark where it is afterwards. And it should be the same amount of rise, roughly, as you would have in a tube. Probably the bigger your tube, like a swimming pool, would be more accurate because it's gathering up a bigger sample size, basically. But it should be roughly the same, I think.
Yeah, I'm mathematically challenged, so it takes me a second.
Now, the people who have weather stations, I think they're doing it in something more digital, right? So it's not, like for me, my tube only goes to 5 inches. So I don't know how much rain we have. We had more than my tube would hold. But those guys who have a weather station, I don't know how it measures it. It's somehow running the water through, and it's a continual measurement thing.
Yeah. It's it's one I kind of always enjoy, these little events like this, which is kind of weird to say because I know depending on where you live, it could be a not fun and even devastating thing. But most of the time around here, anyway, hurricanes are pretty mild and just makes you stay inside, which is what I want to do already. So.
Somebody who understands storms better than me will have to explain this to me. I always thought that after the storm, it's super clear and the sky is blue because all of the clouds are being sucked into the low pressure system of the storm. And so once it goes, it's supposed to be clear and pretty and beautiful because everything got sucked into that storm. But I'm not sure why we still have drizzle and rain, and we'll keep having it. I sort of expected to walk outside to like the most beautiful weather, but it's not that way at our house anyway.
Maybe it'll get there.
Maybe. I'm sure that we have a hobby meteorologist in our church that can explain that to me on Sunday.
Yeah. It reminds me, I have a vivid memory of when I was a kid. Maybe I was 4 or 5 or something. And there was a flood that came. I don't know if it was a hurricane or tropical storm or what, but our yard basically flooded, and we lived right by a river at the time, so the road right next to us was flooded, and I'm pretty sure out at the road it was like literally over my head, which I was small then, obviously.
Wow.
But it was just crazy to see water like that over my head, and there was like water literally like cascading across our yard that you could almost surf on. And it was like I lived on a water park for a couple of days. It was.
Was that on Woodline?
No, that was on Mud Lake, a little road that kind of peels off of Mud Lake. So,
yeah, well, understandable. Mud Lake.
Yeah.
is called Mud Lake for a reason.
Yeah, and we did have a little bit of fun with it yesterday. Me and Heidi, we went out and splashed in the puddles a little bit.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You look with your big rubber boots and your rain jacket. You're ready for the storm. That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Speaking of kids, I'm wearing a shirt. I don't know if you can see it. This was my birthday present.
The classic.
Keep all my jokes in a database. Love it.
Nice.
Nice. All right, man. You want to talk about the sermon from yesterday?
Let's do it.
I've been enjoying these, and weirdly, a handful of other people seem like they're enjoying it too. So, some people are gluttons for punishment.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm certainly enjoying it, and there's a lot to talk about with this one. So you were in 2 Samuel 16, starting at verse 15, and then you went through chapter 17, verse 14. And if you just kind of look at the main events of that passage, it really surrounds these two guys that act as counselors to Absalom. And the two guys are Hushai and Ahithophel. And it talks about how they both interact with Absalom, who is David's son, who has taken the kingdom by force, led a rebellion against his father, David, and he's taken the throne for himself. And they're going to counsel David in different ways. And so that's the basic events of the passage, I would say. But really the overall theme is the sovereignty of God. And you see that theme really building up to the story and throughout the story all along leading up to this point. But especially at the end where it mentions that all of these things, very clearly that all of these things happen because God wants them to happen this way.
So real quick, this isn't super important, but interesting for me. I've always, in my mind, put the sovereignty of God and the providence of God, God ordaining things, as words that mean the same thing.
Yeah.
And I still think they basically do. But I read that the difference between the word sovereignty and providence is connected with purpose. So sovereignty means you have sort of like the size and ability to do things.
Yeah.
But providence throws in the idea of the ability to accomplish your goals.
Yeah.
So it's basically providence is sovereignty with a purpose, which I've never heard that before. I understood it. That's kind of the introduction to John Piper's book, Providence.
Yeah.
But you know how he is. He goes through a whole chapter proving that one point with every single passage in the Bible.
I think I remember him saying in that book that kind of literally the word providence, if you break it down, means something like to see toward something. And it's almost, it calls to mind a phrase like what we use to see to it that something is done, like he sees to it that his will is done in the world. And that's his providence.
You sort of can hear it. The vidence, the vidence is I think it's the Latin word for video, which is or the word we get video from, vision, and so that helps me remember it. Pro, which can mean before or toward, either one. So to provide means to see ahead of time, and in a sense, it's just to literally like a prevision of something. Like I saw it before it happened, but it's always had the connotation of to see to it ahead of time, right? Like like you said, not just I can predict the future, but that I'm responding to what I predict will happen in the future in a way that accomplishes what I want to accomplish.
It's really a beautiful word too. I just love the word providence.
Yeah.
What it means is beautiful too.
Yeah, I think so too. There was a super long quote that I almost shared by Charles Spurgeon where he just talks about how beautiful the word is. And I just thought, well, as much as I loved it because he writes beautifully, we were already crunched for time, so I took it out. But I do agree. It's a beautiful word. Anyway, that was a long aside that was just on the beauty of the word providence.
Yeah. And you So starting at verse 15, it talks about Hushai, and he comes to Absalom, and he basically says, "Hey, I want to be on your team now."
Right.
And because Hushai was a friend of David's, but now he's coming to Absalom. He says, "Long live the king." And you talked a little bit about a potential double meaning there, or maybe Hushai is kind of using his words carefully in a way that the meaning is not so clear. Could mean different things.
Yeah.
I'll ask you about that in a minute. But he comes to Absalom. He says, basically, "I'm on your team now." Absalom seems a little suspicious, and he's like, where's David? Aren't you friends with David? But Hushai's we know based on last week that this is part of the plan that him and David had come up with, that Hushai would go and be a part of Absalom's administration and basically act as a spy in that context, because he would send word back to David about things going on, with Absalom. And so with that, thinking about the double meaning thing again. So let me just read some of the things that you argued could have kind of different meanings or different connotations,
Right.
To them. So he comes in verse 16. He says, "Long live the king," and it's like you could ask, well, who is that king? He's saying long live the king. Is he talking about Absalom, or is he talking about David?
Right.
And then verse 18, Hushai says, "No, for whom the Lord and his people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain." So Hushai says, I'm going to be with the guy that God has chosen.
Right.
And again, it raises the question, who is actually in Hushai's mind? Is it David or is it Absalom? And even that last statement in verse 19, again, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? As I have served your father, so I will serve you. You said that could have the meaning of I'm serving your father by coming and serving you,
right.
at least as a fake serving you, by ostensibly serving you. I'm actually serving your father by doing that. So it made me think, like, is that just something we can kind of notice about the text and think that's kind of interesting? Is that do you think maybe like a literary decision that's being made there to represent his words in that sort of double meaning way, or is there like is the text kind of getting us to see, or kind of wanting us to see that Hushai is technically not lying to Absalom because I mean, I've always thought that, if there's an intention to deceive, even if the words you say are technically true, if they're being spoken in a way that's intended to deceive or mislead, it's still a lie. You know what I mean? And would it have been okay for Hushai to just lie outright to Absalom? I don't know if my question's making any sense, but I just wondered kind of what you see as the importance or significance of how Hushai talks there.
Well, it's a good question.
Is there significance to it? I mean,
so here's another thing that was kind of chopping block stuff. So I thought this does raise the exact question that you are asking: is what does this teach me about honesty? The only commentator that talked about it was A.W. Pink. Everybody else just sort of accepted it and went on. Like, this is just what's going on. And A.W. Pink basically said Hushai did wrong and God blessed him anyway, which I think he would say the same thing about Rahab and hiding the spies and
the Hebrew midwives hiding Moses.
Yeah, Moses, right? And so
it's a debate among Christian ethics, right?
Yep.
If it's ever okay to lie and under what circumstances and that kind of thing.
That's right. So I don't know if you remember this book. We read it. I had a different cover, but this is the one I just have near me. The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. She is in Poland during World War II. They're rounding up the Jews. She's Polish, but she's a Jewish sympathizer and hides them in her house. And at one point, this is in the beginning of chapter 7, they have this big conversation about, well, is what they're doing moral, right? Chapter 7 is Yusi, but in the very beginning of it, and that's just the lady's name, but in the very beginning of it, they have this little trap door underneath their kitchen table, and they hide all these Jews under the table. And then they put a rug over it, and then they put the table on top of the rug, and then they put the tablecloth on the table, and they sit around and they're playing cards, and that's when the Secret Service walks in, and we heard you're hiding Jews, what's going on? And Corrie ten Boom and her sister disagreed about what to do, and Corrie ten Boom basically said, lie, like, nope, we don't have any Jews, see you later. And her sister says, oh no, God's people never lie. And so she took the lead. The sister took the lead, and they come in and they say, where are they? The soldier said, and she goes in and she starts giving this long answer, and they're like, don't give us a long answer. Tell us exactly where they are right now. And she says, Kaki did not miss a breath. Why? They're under the table. Motioning all of us away from it with his gun, the soldier seized a corner of the tablecloth. At a nod from him, the taller man crouched with his rifle cocked, and he flung back the tablecloth. As the last pent-up tension exploded, Kaki burst into spasms of high, hysterical laughter, and the soldiers whirled about. Was the girl laughing at them? Don't take us for fools, the short one snarled. Furiously, he strode from the room, and minutes later, the entire squad trooped out. Not, unfortunately, before the silent soldier had spied and pocketed our precious packet of tea. It was a strange dinner party, and they go on and talk about how they all sat around and debated whether or not her sister had done the right thing. Now, clearly, God provided. She told the exact truth. They're under the table. Well, not the exact truth, but she said they're under the table, which they were. But they were under the floor under the table, and he thought they meant just under the table.
Yeah.
And so she felt that she had told the truth. And anyway, Corrie ten Boom goes on to say, if you tell the truth with an intention to deceive, or at least hoping they'll be deceived, you're still not telling the truth. And she said, we spent our lives lying for the Lord without lying, basically. She said we wore costumes, like a maid's costume, to give us an excuse to be in this room. And we did these things so that the secret police wouldn't find us out. And she said, and I believe at the end of the day, what her position at the end of the day is, I did the very best I could, and I trusted that God saw my faith. And I'm not sure if I did right every single time, but my intention was to obey, and I trusted that God rewarded the intention of my heart. I don't know. So that was that story from The Hiding Place. I thought it was fascinating. I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that godly people, literally hiding Jews, are simultaneously wrestling with when it's okay to lie to people who are in their room with guns.
Yeah. I come down on the view that it is okay to lie in those circumstances, but I do think it's interesting that it's something that believers have always wrestled with.
Yeah. I think that if you are godly, your desire in hiding Jews is not simply to hide Jews. It's to hide Jews to the glory of God, right? Like you're doing it for your love of God. And so the question is, I don't want to love God by disobedience. So I have to wrestle with, is this obedient? And one of the reasons I dropped it is because there's different ways Christians have tried to answer this question. Some have said that it is absolutely disobedient to lie in any way at any time, or to practice deception in any way at any time. And so they just say it's wrong, and they should have just said, yep, we're hiding them, and trust the sovereignty of God to not give you bad rulers. I don't believe that, right? So I'm not on that position. Two other positions. One is that in this fallen world, there are gradations of sin, and we're supposed to recognize that murder is worse than lying, and you choose the lesser of two evils, but with a level of repentance in it. And you just say, God, I'm a man of unclean lips. I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips, and therefore I feel trapped in this world of sin. And you do the best that you can with a spirit of repentance as you do it. And then the other group would say, to choose the lesser of two evils is actually a good, right? And so you don't lie if you don't have to lie. But if you have to, you haven't sinned, and you should actually be proud of your wise choice. And I felt like going into that would have been way too much for our sermon, so I just cut it all out.
Yeah, there's always stuff you gotta cut out.
But I think it's really interesting stuff. I will say that I think the Bible has several times when the rulers that God puts over his people, he has faithful people mislead them as a sign of their faithfulness. And we've already listed those, some of those. And so I do believe that there is strong biblical warrant for saying, if you're ever hiding a Nazi in your house, hiding a Jew in your house, and the Nazis come to your door, don't turn them in, right? Just keep hiding them. But I also appreciate the deep kind of wrestling they did with, we will not lie lightly. We will not mislead lightly. And so that's kind of where I fall on it.
Yeah, agreed. Something else that you talk about in that first exchange between Hushai and Absalom is the idea of friendship, and that the word friend even shows up several times in that little passage there, verse 16, and then a couple of times in verse 17. You see that word friend, and it's even been in the context leading up to this as well.
Right.
That word friend kind of keeps being seen repeatedly. And so you talked about friendship a little bit. You kind of asked the question of what friendship really is, what is or what it should be. You talked about commitment and loyalty, and you mentioned marriage, how marriage is kind of an ultimate example of friendship, somebody that you're committed to for better or worse, not just in good times, but in bad times as well. And then that led you into talking about the difference between a friend and a king, or that relationship of friendship as it relates to a king, and a king calling someone his friend, and ultimately God as our king, who calls us friends. And you made a point that honestly, I'd never really considered, never really noticed that language of friendship in the Bible, and when God calls us friends, which he does in the Bible, that it is only stated, as far as I know, and I did some looking around even before we started recording today, that it's only stated basically in one direction, that God refers to us as his friends, but there's not an example that I'm aware of in the Bible where somebody refers to God as his friend, or like where we refer to God as our friend.
Right.
And I think that was an interesting point, because you wanted to emphasize that the relationship is not perfectly mutual or equal, kind of in both directions. It's not a kind of relationship that puts us in an equal position with God, basically, as if we're on his level or he's down on our level. That's not how this friendship with God works. It's him as an authoritative king declaring to us that we are his friends. And I just couldn't help but think about that for a little while, because it's so if you think about friendship with in terms of how we use the word, how we understand what it means to be a friend. So, if I said that you are my friend, which you are, but then if you were to say, yeah, but you're not my friend, that it would be like, I would feel like there's not really any friendship at all. Like it almost can't just go in one direction in those terms. Like it has to be a mutual thing in order for it to be friendship in human terms anyway. And so it was just interesting to me, because you brought out how the Bible is using this term friend as it relates to God and us is quite different than the way we often use it in human terms. So
That's right.
take that wherever you will.
I do think, like, if you're like, hey, I'm Nathaniel's friend, and I said, well, you're not my friend, right?
Yeah.
That would probably imply that I don't feel positively towards you, right? And so, but I don't want to communicate that. While in the relationship between God and His people, He calls His people friend. They call Him Lord, but the Lord shows steadfast love to His people, right? So
Yeah.
it's not like when He calls them friend, it is a display of His steadfast love, right? And when we call Him our King, that's how we show steadfast love. And so I don't in any way mean to say you should love God and He doesn't love you. He does love you. But the love that He shows because of His authority and power, there is a benevolence that is like how the steadfast love of a king over his people, that we're not on equal terms. We're not pals in that way. I thought it was interesting that there was one commentary that talked about it quite a bit, and Alistair Begg brought this concept up in his sermon as well. And both of them mentioned the song, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. And they both said, I still love this song, right?
Yeah.
Like, they're like, I'm not going to stop singing this song. And I think that
That's where I was going to go with it, actually. I was going to mention there's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. Like this is often a theme in songs that we sing, where God or Christ is identified as our friend and seen as our friend. And I just wanted to ask, are you saying that that's wrong?
No, I wouldn't. And both the commentary and Alistair Begg also went to lengths to say we will still sing this song, and we sing it with all the confidence because what a friend we have in Jesus. While it might use the word friend in a way that the Bible's not using that word, the meaning of the song is the exact point that's being made here. That you have this loyal, steadfast love that never fails. And that comes from your steadfast King. So go to Him. So the point isn't of that song, y'all are pals, that there's an equalness to
Homeboys.
you. Yeah, the homeboy idea. So the point is not a mutuality but in your relationship. And that, I don't think anybody would listen to What a Friend We Have in Jesus and think casualness is the point of that. But I do think casualness is often the point of at least one expression of the way we use friendship in modern talk. Pals, friends, pals, homeboys, right? That is, I can put my guard down around them. I can be who I want to be, and I don't have to worry about who I am around them because they're my friend. And that sense of friendship is just not being implied by the Hebrew word friend, especially when used by a subject talking to the king. The subject before the king, he might be a friend of the king, but that doesn't mean he's not bowing his knee and saying, long live the king, and acting in submission to the king, because they just have a casual relationship with each other. And that's the point that I wanted to really draw out there is, but I'll still sing What a Friend We Have in Jesus.
Yeah. And I think it's good. I think it's a great point. And also it makes me feel better that it's okay that we can still sing those songs.
Yeah, I will. And I do think that I think both of those, I didn't think about there's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. I do think that song is, you can root all of that into the biblical language. I would say that's the lullaby sounding song, right? It's a very sweet, gentle song, and I think that part of what you would want to do as a singer or a music leader is just to ask, on the whole, is there a level of which I can sing that and holy, holy, holy at the same time and not feel that they're in conflict? Like they're the same. It's the same thing. This holy God is my friend, and he's worthy of worship and adoration. He's not like just
Right.
a casual acquaintance of mine, or like a seriously deep friend, but still sometimes he does what I want, sometimes I do what he wants. Like, that's what you want to get away from that.
Yeah. So my mind went to Proverbs. Is it Proverbs 18? Maybe there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother, and that's often applied to Jesus. At least I've often heard it applied to Jesus, but it's really not explicitly, I don't think, intended. I think it's just referring to friendship in general, and a good friend sticks closer than a brother. Or my mind, I thought of the phrase, Jesus being called a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But those are words that are in the mouths of his critics, who are also calling him a drunkard and a sluggard,
Yeah.
And so you can't really use that text. But I think maybe at the end of the day, I would refer to it kind of the way that Paul does when he talks about how he knows God, but then he says, rather, I've come to be known by God. That there's a more emphasis placed on God knowing me rather than me knowing God. And I think maybe I would describe this idea of friendship as it relates to God in the same way, that it's less about God being my friend and more about him calling me his friend.
Yeah. And maybe I would say this too, is that the word friend, like the word love itself, its meaning is in part how it's being used in that context, right? So husbands love your wives obviously means something significantly different than I love Buffalo Wild Wings or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
You can use a word differently. And I just think that it's okay to use the word friend in non-technical ways. And anything that would push toward interpreting this in a way that says, well, this isn't about God loving me. Well, no, that is the whole point. When David calls him friend, he's saying that he's steadfast and loyal. Hushai is loyal to David. But he's also saying, I will show steadfast love to you, right? You're the object of my steadfast love. And so I don't know. I don't want to like overplay this and be like, you have to love God, but he doesn't have to love you. Like, that's certainly not the point of this. He calls you friend as a expression of affection, but it's not an expression of equality in relationship.
Yeah. Well, that's good. So I found myself thinking about that one.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Even though it was not what I would say is the main idea of your sermon, but it was one that had me thinking quite a bit.
I felt like it wasn't the main idea of the passage. However, I did feel like the word was used so often, added to the fact that there seems to me an obvious comparison of these two friends, Ahithophel and Hushai, that it feels like it's being used within a broader theme. It just felt very, very intentional by the author to me. So I thought I had to mention something about it.
Yeah. Well, we probably should move on to Ahithophel. He comes along, or then starting at verse 20, Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give your counsel, what shall we do?" And Ahithophel basically tells Absalom to go into his father's concubines. So David had left his concubines behind to manage the house, I believe is what was said. And Ahithophel is telling Absalom to go into them. And I don't want to be too graphic in this part, but like, this is a pretty explicit, weird thing that's happening. And by doing this, Ahithophel says you're going to make yourself a stench in your father's nostrils. And it's almost like totally burning whatever bridge might be left relationally between them. And, basically, what do you think about all that? And then also how it mentions Ahithophel being one that is consulted like the word of God. Like, people looked at Ahithophel and his counsel as being like consulting with God himself. And that's a weird thing to say right after he tells Absalom to go and do something like this. Like, how does all that work?
I thought so too. I thought, what a weird thing to say immediately after such sinful advice.
One of the craziest pieces of advice given in the Bible.
That's right. So, I did in the sermon, I tried to be much more guarded. I mean, you just can't read a passage like this and it not be somewhat explicit. And so we're going to read every passage we come across. And so it was there, but I tried not to get into the grossness of it, but it is, I mean, it's gross, right? It's like, it's a heinous act, and it is, it should be shocking and disturbing to us. That said, I try to also emphasize that there is some cultural precedent for it. And we looked at 2 Samuel 3, where Abner did that to Ishbosheth. One of his, the concubine of Saul would have been his stepmom, or, it was kind of like, if you have multiple wives, what do you call your sister mom or whatever, sister wives, however they do that. So anyway, but Ishbosheth became the king. And so for Abner to take any of Saul's wives was seen as a play on the kingdom of Saul. And Ishbosheth was like, you can't take these women, because it suggests to everyone watching that you're the one that's really in control here. All the power's in your hands. So that's the logic of it. It's gross. It's heinous. It's especially heinous to us. But I think that's why, that context is why Ahithophel's advice would have made sense. And the people would have seen that as not just, hey, we love gross people. They wouldn't have seen it as that. They would have seen it as a political statement of power and ability to control the kingdom. And I don't mean that it's not gross because of that. It is still gross and heinous, but you interpret things in light of the cultural surroundings that you're in, and I think people would have understood the meaning of that to be more than just lewdness. And I think that helps explain why it's like as if one consulted the Word of God. This doesn't mean it's godly advice, but it does mean that it was what he said was true, right? People did respond this way. People did see this as a sign of Absalom's right to rule and his power. And so it wasn't the righteousness of the advice, but there was a kind of truth in that it was effective. And if he tells you something, he's going to understand how people work. He's going to understand what's going to happen. And so you can basically take it to the bank. I think that's the point of it.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. And also, in a way, this passage, though, you mentioned is showing us the sovereignty or the providence of God. And how is it doing that?
So I knew this even ahead of time, but I remember when Alistair Begg did his sermon, he just has a way of expressing things. And he says, I recognize that roof. Right? like, I don't know. It's like almost was kind of like, yeah, that makes sense to me. And we all should think that. I think I got too loud. My microphone was like, listen, don't yell into me, just talk. But that's true. It is a roof that we've seen before. And it reminds us of a promise of God in chapter 12 that he was going to take David's sin that was done in secret, and he was going to have somebody take David's wives and expose them to everybody in the light of the sun. And as you read this, you're like, well, that's coming to pass.
There
right?
it is. Yep.
This is not a surprise to God. It is not. God predicted this a long time ago.
That's right.
And so I think that proves that God is in control, right?
Yeah.
Like none of this is surprising him. None of this is happening without his divine permission, at least.
Yeah.
That's the mystery,
kind of
right?
A little reminder that he's still there. He's still working. He's in the background in a way, but this event reminds us that he's, like you said, he's still in control.
Now, this is the mystery, and I don't know. I can't even remember how much I talked about this. How in the world is it possible that Absalom and Ahithophel are sinning?
Mm-hmm.
God ordained it.
Yeah.
And it's not a sin. I'm sorry, and it's not excused, right? It is still a sin. To which we just say, it is what it is. The free will.
Comparatively easy to say God may work through somebody telling a lie or something like that, something comparatively minor. But I mean, this is like gross, heinous, weird stuff that's going on, and yet God said it would happen. And I don't know, like what I always fall back on when it comes to questions like this is that we don't know everything about the ins and outs of how God operates, or how it is that he brings things about that he has ordained, or that he has predicted would happen. Like if there is, there are senses in which God works that are active, and there are senses in which he works that are passive in terms of allowing things to happen and letting people follow their own desires rather than restraining those desires as he may do at other times. It's probably more, the ways and the works of God and how he operates is more complicated than we can really fathom and imagine. And so remember that, I would say, and know above all that he hates sin. Like, don't let the fact that he might work through human sin, or even ordain human sin, don't let that take away from the fact that it is something that he hates and that's despicable to him. And the biggest example, I think you may have mentioned this last week, the biggest example of God doing that is ordaining the killing of his own son.
Right.
His perfect, sinless son, who was God in the flesh. That's the greatest example of sin, human sin, that God nevertheless ordained and was working through to accomplish his will.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's exactly right. It's at some level, these men are making a kind of free will choice, and I know free will is what does free mean?
Yeah.
They're slaves of sin, right? There's a level of slavery to their sinfulness, but they're making real choices, and they're really opposing the king, and they're opposing the Lord and the Lord's anointed. And they're not pawns in the sense of they don't make decisions. These are real decisions that they're actually making. And at the same time, within that sphere of freedom of whatever that looks like, it's all under God's sovereign control, so that their decision would never be, well, now I can't work all things together for good. And
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right.
I think at some point you just have to say God's bigness is more impressive than we can wrap our heads around. It's not a contradictory thing to say that. It just is hard to imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This funny thing came to my mind as I'm thinking about free will and just that whole philosophical question. I remember one of the things, when I was younger, wondering like who I would end up marrying, and is there like one person out there for me, and I have to, stay in the will of God and wait for kind of the perfect one, that whoever that is that's out there, that's God's perfect one for me. I have to wait for that person. And I get that. Like, honestly, I get the sentiment behind all that kind of stuff that people might say. But then I remember somebody asking me one time, what if that other person, your one, that girl who's out there somewhere, which for me was obviously Abby, but what if she didn't use her free will rightly, and what if she didn't follow God, and it's like would that mess up God's plans for the both of us? And I don't know, I thought that was kind of a fair point to think about, and it just, I guess, drove home to me that I don't need to put my hope in free will to like explain everything, or I don't know if that makes sense, but basically I trust in God and his sovereignty, no matter what human beings may do. I trust that he's working all things for my good.
I think in a very practical way, this has come up for me in marriage counseling before, where two people come and they say, we think we weren't supposed to marry each other, right? Some sort of bad thing happened. It was sin. We shouldn't have done it. We rushed into it when we were young, and we weren't, MFEO, made for each other. We weren't the right ones. And so the reason this marriage is hard is because we were out of God's will. So what we need to do is end this marriage now and then find the right ones. And once we find the right ones, then we'll be in God's will again, and then everything will be good again. And I think what that mentality does is it emphasizes free will in a way that negates the sovereignty of God, right? So it is true, very likely, that your sins were rebellion against God, of which you need to repent and confess and say, we didn't do things correctly. But for Christians, we have to say, at the same time, God has sovereignly been moving all things together so that you are where God wants you to be. And that the trials that you're facing in your marriage right now are God's plan to consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And even if your marriage is hard because of sinful choices you've made, they're hard. If you're a Christian, they're hard in the goodness of God. It's for your good at the end of the day. So you don't. It basically frees you from the out of making your old sins an excuse for your new sins. That's what the sovereignty of God to me does on a very practical level.
Yeah, that's good.
Good. All right.
Anything else on that one? Moving on.
Yeah, let's move on.
So into chapter 17 now. That's where we get kind of the competing advice now. Absalom has these two counselors now in Hushai and Ahithophel. Ahithophel has been really talked up, somebody who knows what he's talking about, and he does know what he's talking about. And first we get what Ahithophel wants Absalom to do. So now this has to do with how to pursue David, what to do about David. And so Ahithophel gives his advice, and it's, if you just look at it in the text, it's a much shorter piece of advice. And you talked about why that is, or kind of the nature of Ahithophel's advice, and how would you describe it and sum it up quickly?
Yeah, I think it was 42 Hebrew words, and I think that, I don't know why several commentators emphasize length there, but it is short, sweet, to the point.
It is an interesting point, I think.
Yeah, I included it because I loved the line that I stole from John Woodhouse, that 42 words were trumped by 129 words, but they were all trumped by 14 words, right? And I just like that phraseology. It was memorable. At the end of the day, it's the will of the Lord that won out. And so I like that. It just stuck with me. Anyway, Ahithophel's advice is, we can talk about it a little bit, not a lot, but I wonder if Ahithophel is actually here showing a little bit of moral desire here. He wants to send what is a smaller force. So it says 12,000 men, which sounds like a lot. But the clear idea here is that there's a group of guys that are ready to go. He doesn't have to go recruit anybody. He says, I'm going to go grab a group. We're going to leave tonight while he's still weary, discouraged, and I'm going to be able to strike. And the strike is going to happen in such a way that he will be the only one who dies, right? Nobody else needs to die except for David. And then everybody else is just going to come home, right? They're defending David, but David's dead. They'll come back, and everybody serves you. And it seems to me similar to the high priest with Jesus. One man can die to save everybody is kind of the advice of Ahithophel here. And so he wants to go kill David. And so I say it's moral. It's immoral because he's opposing the king. But later on, well, you'll probably talk about it next week. What is it that motivates Ahithophel's suicide? I wonder if Ahithophel just saw everything working differently, right? I think I'm saving the nation. We're headed for war, and I think I figured out how to unify us and keep us from heading into war. And that's his plan. And everybody says, yeah, that's a really good plan. But for whatever reason, it's not the one that stuck.
Yeah. Well, so Hushai comes along, or Absalom says in verse 5, call Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear what he has to say, which is interesting because Ahithophel, as respected as he is, Absalom says, no, I want to hear what Hushai says too. And so Hushai comes in, and Hushai basically says, Ahithophel's a great guy and he's smart, but he's not right this time. And instead, what you need to do is basically
go big or go home.
Yeah, go big or go home. Gather the biggest force you can. Take some time to gather up all the troops you can, and then just go out and make all out war, basically, against David, and show your strength.
And I think one of the things that is a big deal is gather them to your banner, right? Like, don't send out your general. Make them gather the nation to you. Show your strength, and you'll win this country by showing them that you're the powerful one here.
Absalom's a prideful man, obviously, and Hushai is playing to that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's interesting. You can talk about this next week because it's something I left out. But Hushai's only job was to inform David about the plans, right? So the fact that he wasn't in the room means he almost missed out on it, and it's just God's provision to get Absalom to think, let's call him in. And so when Absalom tells him Ahithophel's plan, Absalom basically did exactly that's all he had to do, and now he's got to get word to David. And the question is, how is he going to do that? But this plan, the brilliance of this plan is it was a stalling technique, where originally, it was going to be a quick, immediate strike. There was going to be no way to get word to David. He's saying, okay, we're going to go big. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be a giant battle. But it's going to take us a couple of days to get everybody into order, because you're going to have to recruit everybody. And that gives David time to respond. And so that's the brilliance of the plan here.
That's smart.
Yeah.
So, Hushai gives his advice. They pick Hushai over Ahithophel, and then you have verse 14, which says all of it ultimately is about God getting what he wants. And so, you ended on that note. And then you went into kind of connecting it to Christ. And if you want to say anything else before we go there, you can.
No, we can go on there.
Okay. So you talked about how this shows how God takes the wisdom of the world and basically turns it on its head, that the wisdom of God thwarts the wisdom of the world. And in that, it's emphasizing to us that that God is able, that it emphasizes that God is the one who gets things done, not human beings. And you talked about how that ultimately is on display in the person and work of Christ, and that no one ever would have really thought of it this way. No one would have really expected God to work in this way, to a baby born in a manger, for God's Son to be born as a man, and to live amongst us as human beings, and to experience the weakness and the frailty of being human and everything that means, and then ultimately go to the cross to die in our place. That's something the world would look at and think of as weakness and think of as foolishness, but that's actually the wisdom of God, and how God shows himself mighty to save, that salvation belongs to him and he can accomplish it, and delights to accomplish it actually through things that look foolish to the world or weak to the world.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that a good summary of your
nailed
wrap up?
You nailed it. This was, I mentioned in that I kind of written my small group questions before I wrote the ending a little bit. So I knew I wanted to talk about the value of, for us, as we reflect on Hushai conquering, the weaker counselor basically conquering the stronger counselor, and how that's meant to be encouraging to us. And there's a whole long list of things. in that First Corinthians passage, I saw two ways that were kind of like Hushai. One is the cross is like Hushai. It's the weaker, it's what's considered folly that defeats the wisdom of this world. But then, like that, after kind of a first long paragraph where he talks about the cross being folly, then he says, and by the way, so are all of you guys. He's like, if you're honest about it, you're not the wise of this world that God's called into the church. The cross is folly, and he chooses people who, by and large, aren't the wise of this world to be the display of his wisdom. And I find that to be a little bit insulting and but encouraging. Like, your ability to represent God in this world in a way that displays his wisdom and his power is not dependent on you being the smartest person in the room. And I find that to be encouraging. But it's ultimately because I left that out because it's secondary to me in my mind of the reason that you don't have to be the smartest person in the room is because God is the smartest person in the room. And God proved it by doing what everybody else thought was dumb and making it brilliant. And that involves him killing his own son on our behalf. And that's how he proved he took. Everybody would have said that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. You're going to kill your son in order to save everybody? Killing people doesn't save people. And he says, watch this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was a great transition into participating in communion together.
Yeah,
on Sunday. So
yeah, I kind of mentioned this, and I'll just read it real quick because I don't know when else we would mention it. I got this from Dale Ralph Davis, and I don't know. There were some people that were reading his commentary, and I don't know if anybody still is in it or not, but he said at the end of his section, the tradition of the Lord's Supper probably refers to Judas's work in the opening words, the Lord Jesus, in the night he was handed over. Or, most translations say, the night he was betrayed. But he translated it as handed over because of that word paradidomai, which nobody knows that unless you learn Greek. But paradidomai is a word that can be translated a bunch of ways. Betrayal, or handed over, or given up. And so he says, yet Paul uses the same verb elsewhere with God as the subject. He who did not hold back his very own son, but handed him over for us all. That's Romans 8:32. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, Judas wickedly hands over the Son of God, but actually God hands over his son. And mysteriously, Judas's scheme only carries out God's design. He says this is perhaps the ultimate humiliation for all who oppose God and his kingdom. The truth is clear whether you can fit its pieces together or not. It is the word of 2 Samuel 16. The betrayer only carries out Yahweh's word. And that can prove solid solace to the people of God when we are in the presence of our enemies. And I mentioned that, and I don't know that I'd explain it with as much precision as he did, but I find it to be, well, you mentioned it earlier too. I just find it to be an amazing display. The pinnacle of the display of the sovereignty of God is that he takes the betraying work of his enemies and he makes it the providing work of his son for all who are in him. And I think it's just a cool thing.
Yeah, for sure. It's powerful. It's good stuff. It was a good message. And
thanks. Now you're up next week. I told you I was going to go in the beginning of the week. I said, I'm going to get way farther, and then it went way shorter. And so you can figure out, you thought that you were going to be probably starting later than where you actually are starting. And so we'll see how much you decide to cover.
I'll at least make it through the rest of chapter 17, I would think. And then from there, I don't know. We'll see. You've got some interesting things to cover next week for the people that are reading ahead. You have the hiding in a well, which kind of reminds us of Rahab. And you have obviously the suicide of Ahithophel, which reminds us a little bit of Judas. And it's just that's one of the other things that I've loved about 2 Samuel is how often I'm reading something and being like, well, being reminded of something else.
The Bible is so connected, so interwoven. So anyway, looking forward to you doing that next week. Who's doing music next week? Do you know?
Jesse.
All right.
Yep, I believe Jesse agreed to. So,
Excellent.
It'll be good.
All right, I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks for the conversation, man. Enjoyed
Yeah.
it as always.
All right. See ya.
See ya.